Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into something that really affects, well, everyone's wallet and also global relationships. We're talking tariffs, specifically their real economic impact. And our main source for this is some really sharp analysis from Professor Don Boudreaux at George Mason University. We're looking at his piece called Donald Boudreaux, Trump's Tariffs Are a Disaster. So our goal here, we want to kind of cut through all the noise, give you the essentials on the economics and actually the legal side of tariffs too. Think of it as, your shortcut to getting your head around a really complex topic. We've got some surprising facts, some context you might not hear everywhere else.
Yeah, and what's really interesting right from the start, the way Boudreaux sets it up, is this idea of a sort of bipartisan decline in fiscal sanity in the U.S.
Yeah.
He basically argues that, both main political parties seem increasingly willing to kind of ditch sound economic principles,
No.
maybe for things that sound more populist.
That's quite a frame, isn't it? Not just looking at one policy like tariffs, but seeing it as part of, a bigger trend away from solid economics. So, okay, how does he then connect that broader idea, that decline in fiscal sanity, to the specific effects of tariffs? What's the tangible impact?
Well, he's very direct. He says tariffs will, quote, unambiguously make Americans poorer, end quote. No ifs, ands, or buts. And even though trade is maybe, 20% of the U.S. economy, it plays this absolutely vital role in, driving growth and making things efficient.
Okay, so that's a really strong opening statement from Boudreaux. He's arguing, forget the political spin. These things don't just work badly. They actively make people poorer. That flies right in the face of the idea that there's some kind of quick fix for the economy.
Exactly. And he uses this term, supply webs, instead of supply chains.
Yeah.
Because he wants to emphasize how incredibly complex and interconnected these global production networks really are. They're not just linear chains. So when you disrupt these webs with tariffs, you directly reduce efficiency. And that means, slower GDP growth. He points to, the World Bank projecting U.S. growth slowing down, partly because of these trade barriers. The OECD says something similar, too, that, globalization makes these kinds of tariffs especially damaging.
Right, these supply webs, it sounds like they're maybe way more fragile than we tend to think. You pull one thread and a lot more unravels. But it's not just the economics, is it? There's this whole legal and constitutional side to it, particularly with those specific tariffs they call the Liberation Day tariffs. What's the issue there?
Yeah, that's a big one, legally speaking. The administration at the time, they justified those tariffs by saying trade deficits were a national emergency. Boudreaux just finds that rationale, absurd. He points out the U.S. has had trade deficits for, decades. They don't suddenly become an emergency overnight.
Huh. That's really interesting because it cuts against so much of what you hear, right? That deficits are automatically bad. So if that's the case, why isn't this other idea that trade deficits actually mean capital inflow, why isn't that more, understood in the debates? And how does that maybe link to the legal arguments, especially for those Liberation Day ones, which used, a 1977 law? Something about national security powers.
That's exactly the connection Boudreaux makes. It's a crucial point. These deficits, they aren't a sign of weakness. They actually show foreign money flowing in. Foreigners investing here, buying assets, starting businesses. It sounds backwards to a lot of people, but it's fundamental economics. And yeah, the legal side hinges on that 1977 law, usually Section 232. It lets the president put tariffs on imports if they're deemed a threat to national security. Boudreaux's argument is that calling trade deficits a national emergency under that law was a massive stretch, way beyond what Congress intended when they delegated that power. I mean, the Constitution gives Congress the power to tax imports, to set tariffs. Congress has delegated some of that, sure, but Boudreaux argues this specific use was, constitutionally questionable, and it sparked this ongoing legal fight.
Wow. Okay. So you have an economic misunderstanding potentially driving a legal stretch. I remember reading a trade court initially stopped the tariffs, but then an appeals court put them back. So could this actually end up at the Supreme Court?
Oh, absolutely. It definitely could. The whole back and forth in the courts just shows how controversial and legally shaky using these emergency powers for tariffs really is.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Boudreaux makes another point that really pushes back against a very common story, especially around manufacturing jobs. The whole narrative about jobs being stolen by other countries, he says the actual data paints a very different picture.
Yeah, he does. He points out, look, U.S. unemployment has generally been low. Manufacturing output, the actual stuff being made, is near all-time highs. And real wages for blue-collar workers have actually seen some gains. So this idea that, say, China just stole American jobs through trade, He sees that as mostly a myth, not really backed up by the economic facts.
Okay, but hang on. There has been a big drop in the number of manufacturing jobs over the long term. So if it wasn't trade, what was the main reason for that decline?
Right, and there definitely was a decline. Huge, actually. From maybe 30% of the workforce back in the 50s down to around 8% now. But Boudreaux argues, and the data supports this, that it's overwhelmingly because of mechanization, automation, technology. It's a long-term shift. Think about agriculture, right? Over 200 years, farming jobs plummeted. Not because of foreign food imports, primarily, but because of tractors, combines, better techniques, fewer people needed. He says that same powerful force, innovation, is what's been happening in manufacturing.
Wow. Framing it like that really changes the perspective, doesn't it? It's less about villains stealing jobs and more like an almost inevitable economic evolution driven by technology. It makes you think how many popular stories might miss the mark because the underlying economic forces are just so much bigger.
Exactly. And that brings us to another one of his criticisms, the way specific sectors get targeted. Like the tech sector. He talks about the pressure on Apple, for instance, this idea that they must make iPhones in the US or else face a huge, like 25% tariff.
That sounds really direct, trying to force a company's hand. But what does Boudreaux say is the likely economic result of making a company like Apple abandon its supply webs and try to bid everything here?
Well, he argues it pretty much guarantees higher costs for Americans, for consumers. Why? Because these companies, like Apple, have spent years optimizing everything globally, finding the most efficient, lowest cost ways to make things. If you force them to ditch that and make everything domestically, quality might drop, or more likely prices have to go up, which means, you and I buy fewer iPhones or maybe settle for something less advanced. Economically, it's like forcing a square peg in a round hole. It's just less efficient. And beyond just iPhones, it means resources in the U.S. get pulled into less productive uses, potentially hurting other American industries that could benefit from efficient global trade. It hits the consumer's wallet in the end.
That really spells out the practical impact, doesn't it? So pulling all this together, what are the main economic lessons Boudreaux really wants us, the listeners, to take away from his analysis?
I think there are three core messages. First, protectionism, these tariffs, they hurt consumers. Higher prices, less choice. Simple as that. Second, those trade deficits, they're not some evil sign of failure. They actually reflect capital coming into the country, foreign investment. Often a sign of economic health, actually. And third, this idea of economic nationalism, trying to bring all production home no matter the cost. It just ignores the benefits of global specialization, makes things less efficient, and ultimately makes everyone poorer.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive into Professor Boudreaux's critique, it feels like some really critical points have come through. We've heard the argument that tariffs, despite maybe political intentions, unambiguously make Americans poorer. They do this by messing up those complex supply webs and making everything less efficient, not by actually boosting the economy. And it's also pretty clear, based on this analysis, that trade deficits aren't economic crises. They're more like a mirror reflecting capital inflow, showing investment in the U.S. And of course, we can't ignore those big legal and constitutional questions around using emergency powers like Section 232 to impose tariffs. That's still playing out. We also tackled some common myths, didn't we? Especially the idea that trade killed manufacturing jobs, when the evidence points much more strongly towards mechanization and automation. And the related point that protectionist policies, in the end, tend to boomerang back and hit consumers with higher prices and fewer options. So thinking about all this, the complexity of the global economy, the economic principles Boudreaux lays out, it leaves you with a question, doesn't it? What happens when we as a society consistently lean towards perceived short-term fixes or popular narratives, even when they clash with long-established economic understanding and data? How does really getting a handle on these dynamics shape your view, your perspective on the economic policy choices we face down the road? Definitely something to think about.